Hello again. I'm back with another video, and this time I decided I was going to be rating all of the games in Shovel Knight Treasure Trove in a tier list because, tier list videos do well, and a lot of people have been asking me to talk about basically my thoughts and give my critique on every game. And I'm a huge fan of the Shovel Knight series, Shovel Knight Treasure Trove being my favorite game of all time, and all four of these games, if they were counted as their own separate games, would all be very high on my favorite game of all time list. But I do have some problems with certain ones, and I do like certain ones a lot better than others. So a lot of people ask me about that, and that's why I'm going to be ranking these games today. Now, as a warning, there's going to be spoilers in this, and my opinions may change on this. Just as they have throughout the years, they've always changed. Like, I really did not like King of Cards when it first came out, but it's warmed up on me a lot since. So anyway, I'm going to be ranking these games based on 3 criteria. So there's only 5 to rank. So that means I'm going to be actually ranking all the games 3 times based on different criteria. So I'm going to first just tell you my personal preference, just pure which one do I want to turn on more than the others. Then I'm going to tell you kind of what I think if I were to look at them in a more objective light, like if you were a new player, if you were a new Shovel Knight series, or a new Shovel Knight player, and you were going to review all the games afterwards, kind of what would you think? Completely divorced from the context of their release. Then I'm going to be talking about each one of them within the context of their release. So kind of talking about how, I would say how well they did at launch and how well they satisfied the fans at launch. So starting off with personal preference, Plague of Shadows is just an S tier game for me personally. It's my favorite story and characters, my favorite movement, incredibly unique gameplay. There's no games that play like it. It did a really good job of expanding the world and giving just a lot more to care about the Shovel Knight story. It made it a lot more unique and showed what they could do with the world. It really showed the potential of the world building. I love how it plays with perspective. I always like to compare it to time travel movies where you see the same events from a different perspective. And it's just the game that made me care about Shovel Knight in general. Even though I played the original game, Plague of Shadows is the one that made me really excited for what Yacht Club Games was going to do next. So similarly, Spectre of Torment is also an S tier game. And this is just because I really love tragic stories. My favorite movie ever is Revenge of the Sith, as you know from the video I made on it. And I just love tragic stories. I love Shakespearean tragedies. I love stories where everything goes wrong and it's kind of dark and broody like that. I also love how it takes the world building that was expanded in Plague of Shadows and just completely runs with it. I love how the gameplay is fast-paced and tight, but still allows you a lot of freedom. So it's a lot tighter than Plague of Shadows, but it allows a lot more freedom than Shovel of Hope and King of Cards. It's kind of a good balance, I think. Spectre Knight's just a really cool character, and I love being able to choose the level order as well. That's a unique thing that you can really only do in this game. You can choose every level in a completely unique order. So yeah, that's why Spectre of Torment's S tier. Also, completely killer soundtrack. Remixed all the tracks in the game. It's just fire. So Shovel of Hope is going to be an A tier game for me personally. And it's just a straightforward, solid, heartwarming game, but it doesn't really have much reason for me to want to revisit it. Like, I constantly replay Plague of Shadows and Spectre of Torment, and I still revisit them all the time. Even, like, 4 years, almost, I think, 6 years after Plague of Shadows came out, I still am constantly replaying them. Shovel of Hope I replay a lot less, mostly just because it's got the least unique about it, but it's still just a really, really solid game. I wish it could be a bit faster, is the only thing. But that's, it's fine that it's not that fast because it's more of like a Mega Man style. It was a lot more traditional than the other two. And the last thing is that Shovel Knight himself is not nearly as interesting as Plague Knight and Spectre Knight, just both as a character and gameplay wise. But again, that's totally fine because they had to get their footing before they could start, doing crazier things. So King of Cards is going to be B tier, and B tier on the Shovel Knight Treasure Trove tier list is still really good. King of Cards is still one of my favorite games of all time. I just don't like it as much as the other three. The main things that I do like about it are, it's just a really solid platformer. It's not as good overall as the other three, in my opinion, platforming-wise, but it's still just a really fun one. It's definitely in, like, the S-tier platformers overall. Joustus is fun, just generally. I wish that if I had a choice between them focusing a lot more on the platforming and focusing on, like, half and half Joustus and platforming like they did, I would have chosen more platforming, but Joustus is fun either way. What else? Let me look at my notes here. Oh, yeah. So the main two things that I have gripes with the King of Cards that push it down to B tier are the ending I find really unsatisfying. It does not give you nearly as much catharsis and kind of wondering what's next for this character as Spectre of Torment does. Spectre of Torment leaves you with a lot of questions, but it also leaves you very satisfied. Whereas King of Cards is really lacking in that catharsis. It's just, well, I guess King Knight's just kind of a jerk, you know what I mean? And the final boss as well is just awful, I think. Like, the rest of the game is so much better designed than the final boss. The final boss is actually awful, in my opinion. But it's still an amazing game, and I actually revisited a lot more than Shovel of Hope, just because I love just blasting through the short levels really quickly. Like, you can beat the whole game in a very, very short amount of time. Just sit down and blast through it. So I really like it for that. It's overall just still a really solid game. Showdown, for my personal preference, is just D tier. I just don't like it. I'm sorry, it's just not fun to me. I really like fighting games, so it doesn't scratch that itch very well because it's kind of a watered down fighting game. Like, it's not a fighting game, it's a platformer. It's a platformer battle mode, not a fighting game. So the fighting combat is just really not satisfying to me, especially because in all these games you can hit your enemies really rapidly, especially in Plague of Shadows and Spectre of Torment. Actually, in Shovel of Hope. All three of these games you can do it really rapidly, just easily. And in King of Cards, you can do it if you're really good and you understand, like, or if you have a lot of heirlooms. I was trying to figure out what they're called, relics, I forgot. If you have a lot of heirlooms and you're skilled with them, or if you're just really good at, like, quick kills and stuff, you can get that same kind of satisfaction out of King of Cards. But in Showdown, everyone gets invincible as soon as you hit them, and most characters are pretty small as well, so you don't really get that satisfying, like, combo action that you kind of get from the other games. You just kind of hit them once and have to run away, or else you're going to get punished. It's lacking in options, the story's not great. Like, it really just feels like they put a lot less effort into this game than the other four, and it's just a lot less fun because of it. Like, there's not really much to do as a single player, and whenever I turn it on and try and get other people to play it with me, like, I first thought that I didn't like it just because I was playing it alone and it's a multiplayer game, but then whenever I played with people in multiplayer, they'd always be like, why are you forcing me to play this crappy Smash Bros ripoff when we could just be playing Smash Bros? And they would get bored way faster than I would. So I don't think it's a me problem, I think it's just not that good. I wish they had put more effort or more time into, like, King of Cards or other projects rather than making Showdown, but they had to make it because they promised a battle mode. So now we're going to go into the kind of objective tier ranking. This is just my personal preference, but the objective ranking is kind of me putting aside my own personal biases and trying to really evaluate each game for what it is. And it's also coming from the perspective of a new player who isn't around for the context of these games' releases. So we're gonna put these games all back. Is that a thing? That's not a thing. Okay. Yeah, I can't put them back. Okay. So On the objective tier ranking list, in the S tier, I'm going to put Spectre of Torment just because it has the best combination of platforming and storytelling of all the games. The platforming is incredibly tight, and so is the storytelling. But it's the platforming still allows you a good degree of freedom while not being too free like Plague of Shadows, especially for a new player. It's got like I said before, the story is tragic and engaging and cathartic. The soundtrack is fire. It's just an amazing game. Like, this is just an S tier experience for new players or for people who've played other games in this series. So I'm gonna put Shovel of Hope in the A tier again. Believe me, I promise you it will divert from my personal preference one. I promise you. So I put Shovel of Hope in the A tier for objective just because, like, it was really critically acclaimed. It's just a really well-designed platformer. It's much better designed than all the games it was inspired by far. It took what those games did and made it, like, actually fun in the modern era. So it's not really as unique, but it takes things that used to be unique that we liked but had these flaws, like live systems are really lame, like having to restart the whole game when you die too many times is a really lame thing, like that kind of thing. It took those tropes from old games and removed them and just kind of took the things we like. And so that's why it was so successful. That's why Yacht Club Games is now a household name, and Shovel Knight is in every indie game under the sun. Everyone loves Shovel Knight because this game was so good. It's just not as unique as Spectre of Torment. Like, it's very by the books, especially nowadays. There's not as much cool to go back to it about because there's been kind of a platforming renaissance since this game came out. So looking back on it, like, it doesn't seem as great as it was back then because there was a much bigger demand for this kind of game back then. So on the objective list, we're actually going to be putting King of Cards in the A tier. So putting aside my personal biases about, like, my issues with this game has so much content. It just has so much to do, and it just has so much more new than all the other games put together. Like, it's just a fantastic experience overall. Like, I criticized the ending earlier, but the ending being unsatisfying was really only a big problem in the context of its release, so it wasn't satisfying to me. But if you're playing all these games without any wait period, like, the ending won't seem nearly as bad. So because, back to the content point, since it has so much content, it's definitely the best value of any of these games if you purchase them separately. So you can't purchase Plague of Shadows separately, but this game is $15, Shovel of Hope, and Spectre of Torment is $10, and King of Cards is also $10. But Spectre of Torment is the shortest of these games, so $10 makes sense. But King of Cards is far longer and far more content than Shovel of Hope, which is $15, and it's a lot more unique. It's just a much more unique experience compared to this game. So if someone were to be like, hey, which Shovel Knight standalone game should I buy? Honestly, I'd probably say King of Cards. Like, there's just so much to do. And the writing is really charming too. It really shows off why you should care about the Shovel Knight world really well. So I'm putting Plague of Shadows in the B tier for the objective ranking because it reuses a lot of stuff from Shovel of Hope. And when we go into the context of its release list, we'll be kind of factoring in, like, why it's like that. But a lot of people crap on this game nowadays because they don't understand, like, how good it was when it came out, how above and beyond it went, like, because it could have been so much less, and it was just so much when it came out. But we're gonna get to that later. The point is, it reuses a lot from Shovel of Hope, and it can't be bought separately, so you have to buy Treasure Trove. I made a whole video about why that's so annoying for new players. So then they go through all that hassle, they figure out, like, okay, I need Treasure Trove, they buy Treasure Trove, which is $40, which is a lot of money, and then they see, oh, it's all reused assets, and I don't know how to use this guy, and the game doesn't really teach me, because the game just doesn't really teach you. It's supposed to be like a New Game Plus kind of thing. You're just kind of supposed to figure it out on your own. But then it introduces things like the float burst, which, the float burst is the main one that just completely hinders your movement and completely changes the movement. So a lot of people, when they tell me why they don't like Plague of Shadows, they tell me that it's because it's slow and floaty and there's not a lot of freedom in the movement. And then I say, well, did you use the float burst? And they say, yeah. And I'm like, well, the float burst completely changes how the game plays. You can't charge a burst after bursting, and it way slows down the gameplay. And they're just like, well, then it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be encouraged and pushed on me as kind of the crutch. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You're right. It's not your fault that you don't like this game. There's just a lot of things about it that make it hard to like for a new player. But when you do, as a new player, find those things out and you really get that rhythm, it's incredibly satisfying. And it's also just, again, a really overall good game, despite these things that I'm talking about. Showdown is going to be D tier on the objective ranking, just for the same reasons that I was talking about before. Just a reminder, this is in comparison to all the other games. I do not think that Showdown is a bad game overall. It's just, like, it's D tier compared to these games. It's definitely an above average game, or even a good game for sure. It's just not as good as these games. And I already talked about that in my personal preference ranking. It's just not an exceptional party game. It's not an exceptional fighting game for like the competitive side, and it's just not an exceptional single player experience. It's just kind of okay or good and all those things, so it gets D tier. So now when we factor in the context of these games' releases and just kind of what was around at the time, both in the series and what the gaming landscape was like, the tier list is going to shift pretty dramatically. So it means that Shovel of Hope is going in the S tier, because this is the game that turned Yacht Club Games into like an actual company instead of just like those dudes on Kickstarter. Obviously, like, it's huge. This game was huge when it came out. It literally revived like platforming. Pretty much only Nintendo was doing 2D platforming, and at the time, and like on a big scale, excuse me, because a lot of people make platformers all the time, but like this game really just kind of caused a renaissance in the indie platformer scene just because of how good it was. It was, it was critically acclaimed, everyone liked it, and it was a Kickstarter success story, and it's started a lot of trends in gaming nowadays that people don't really credit to Shovel Knight because they're just so ubiquitous. But yeah, so Shovel Knight's S tier. Spectre of Torment I'm also giving S tier in the context of its release, because Plague of Shadows was like an expansion to Shovel of Hope provided for free, and while it was very cool, Spectre of Torment being provided for free and being literally a brand new game was mind-blowing. And not only was it a brand new game, it was a amazing brand new game. Like, it's just fantastic. I really think that Spectre of Torment is just a fantastic game in every way. It also launched with the Switch, which launched with very few titles. So it introduced the series to a lot of people who probably otherwise wouldn't care. Launching it with the Switch was a very, very smart decision from Yacht Club Games. It really worked out for them. It just blew everyone away. It exceeded everyone's expectations, which were already really high. So Plague of Shadows I'm going to put in the A tier for release context. And this is because I kind of crapped on Plague of Shadows in the last section. And that was because what it was trying to do, it did it really well. And it exceeded expectations, but then the other games in the series kind of did that way better. Like they exceeded the expectations even farther. So then when you go back, it's like okay, let's say Shovel of Hope was great. That's a 10 out of 10. Then Plague of Shadows was an 11 out of 10. But then Spectre of Torment was a 15 out of 10. And so is King of Cards. Like, in the amount of new content provided to the player for free, it's like, well, those two things were 15 out of 10. Those are brand new games provided to you for free if you got Treasure Trove. Meanwhile, Plague of Shadows is like, it's a great expansion. It's way more than anyone expected, but it's still like, it's still less than these two after the fact. So that's why when you factor in the context of its release, it seems a lot more exceptional because it was a free expansion that went so above and beyond what it was advertised as. All they had to deliver was a boss campaign, which people just think like, that's like playing as Zero in Mega Man X. Like, that's just playing as a different character in the same game. Like, they could have just changed Shovel Knight's moveset and like barely made any changes to the game overall and cut the dialogue and said it's non-canon and been done with it. They could have done that for all three games, but for Plague of Shadows, that really started the trend of them going above and beyond, and for Plague of Shadows, they almost made a new game. For Spectre of Torment and King of Cards, they just made new games. So, the only reason that I put it in, like, it was exceptional for when it came out. So the only reason that I put it in A tier instead of S tier, factoring in the context of its release, is because, like, people didn't really know what this game was, and a lot of people didn't really know what it existed. The marketing for this game was a lot less than Shovel Knight, which I think is because Shovel Knight was kind of marketed by the people. People were excited for it, whereas Plague of Shadows didn't really get that hype, and Yacht Club Games wasn't really picking up the slack. So people were confused about what it was, they were confused about how to get it, because Nintendo online console infrastructure was garbage at the time, especially on like the 3DS. Getting the update was a nightmare, and it is still a nightmare to get updates in the 3DS. And again, like, the gameplay style kind of alienated people, but for the people who it worked for, it really worked for them. So that's why I knock it below these two games. So again, this is a factoring within the context of release tier list right now. So the objective tier list is like kind of the one you want to pay more attention to for like, if you're like a game review junkie, like you love watching people review video games or something. But this one is more like, how satisfied were the fans when this came out? And so factoring that in, for King of Cards, for me, this goes in C tier purely for two reasons. It took way too long to come out. Way too long to come out. There's absolutely no reason that this game took so long to come out when you consider, like, it was a very big game, but when you consider what other game publishers or game developers are able to do and what Yacht Club Games did in the past with its other games, it's just honestly not really excusable to me that this game took so long to come out. But it would have been fine if they had set a reasonable goal initially and then delayed it like once. But this game was delayed like 3 or 4 times, and the worst part about this game's hype cycle following this game's release was that they gave a release date, and then they, after months, I think years actually, of this game being announced but not having a release date, they gave a release date that wasn't that far off, and then instead of delaying the game another month or something like that, they simply said, oh, the game's delayed, we have no idea when it will come out. And then it came out so much later than it should have. Like, when they delayed it and they didn't give it another release date, there had already been many delays. I was already fatigued. The fandom was already fatigued. But when they did that, that just meant, like, it was impossible to bring myself to care at that point. Like, it had just been too long since Spectre of Torment came out for me to still be hyped about King of Cards. And then when it finally came out, like, my life was in such a different place from when these 3 games were my favorite thing ever and all I could ever think about, that, like, I just couldn't bring myself to care nearly as much when this game came out. Like, the example I always give is, you can chart, like, the activity over time of a Discord server, and after they delayed this game for the last time, the activity of the Shovel Knight Discord that I run was at an all-time low. Like, there was just nothing to talk about. We were all just so disappointed in the fact that it took so long to come out. But it's still an objectively great game. It's still a really great game. It just didn't hit the mark on that. And then the other thing about this game is that the ending, which I've been talking about the ending a lot, but I haven't gone into the specifics about why the ending was unsatisfying. So the ending was a prequel game about a character whose fate was completely set in stone. So Spectre Knight had a lot more mystery around him, but King Knight, you kind of knew almost exactly what would happen to him. It's kind of hard to explain why King Knight was just so much less mysterious than Spectre Knight. He just was. Like, you didn't really care that much about seeing his backstory, or at least I didn't. And then the ending is just exactly where you expect him to end up. Like, he's just a douchebag to everyone who loves him and then kicks them off. And then the ending is just Shovel Knight walking into his castle. Like, oh wow, a completely uninteresting scene from the original game is the, like, linchpin, tie everything together part of the last game in the series. Like, it just I expected so much more from the finale of the saga, and the ending just really did not do that to me, because it was the finale and it took so long to come out. This game came out 6 years after the original game. It took them 6 years to finish Shovel Knight Treasure Trove, and the ending was this. So, what I really wish that they did was, I wish that if you beat all 4 campaigns, there was a ending scene of story to get you hyped for what would come next, because this game left me with no hype for what would come next. This game left me of like, well, I guess Shovel Knight's over then. You know what I mean? Like, it just wasn't a great ending the way that the rest of the games end on kind of a, these two end on like a triumphant note of like a, yeah, I want to see what happens next. And then Spectre of Torment ends on like a, it's very cathartic. It's like, oh, that was bad. Like, it's still satisfying despite not being a triumphant ending. And then King of Cards is just like it's a very meh ending. I felt apathetic at the ending of the game. So, because of that, that's why I put it in C tier. Oh, and the other reason it's in C tier is because it took so long to come out. Like, people just really didn't care that it was coming out. It was really hard to like find people talking about King of Cards pretty much anywhere other than the Shovel Knight Discord. And of course, new game comes out. The Shovel Knight Discord blew up. It got way more people overnight when this game came out. But like, people weren't really talking about it online. There was no real hype around it. Like, I don't know how the game sold, but I feel like it probably didn't sell nearly as well as like Spectre of Torment's standalone. But again, it's not really comparable because the standalones like had a really weird release schedule, so I don't know about sales. I just feel like this game probably underperformed for Yacht Club in the financial department, which I could be completely off on. It just felt like no one really cared when this game came out unless you were a die-hard Shovel Knight fan. And then Showdown is D tier because all the same things as King of Cards. It had all the same release issues because they came out at the same time, if you don't know. Showdown was also delayed just as many times. But like, Showdown had all the issues that I had already talked about, while also taking so long to come out. So like, I booted up Showdown and I was just kind of like, this is it. This is the legendary battle mode. So, in my opinion, honestly, I ideally would have had King of Cards. Like, I would have wished that they developed King of Cards almost in a vacuum. Like, they just pumped out King of Cards and put all their effort into King of Cards and then released it and then released Showdown after, so that they would have had more time. But I understand that they wanted to work on both of them at the same time for the sake of just finishing Shovel Knight Treasure Trove and getting all the Kickstarter rewards out of the way. Because they just wanted to work on different things, and that's totally fine. So to end off, I'm gonna rearrange the tier list to be the objective tier list, just because I feel like that's a better note to end on. This I feel like is the objective tier list. I feel like is the most important tier list. Overall, I just felt like I should rank them in every way. So kind of, if I factor in all of the things that I just said, if I factor in the personal preference tier list, the objective tier list, and the within the context of release tier list, I would say Spectre of Torment is clearly coming out on top here. And then I'm going to put controversial, I know. All three of these games are great. They're all A tier. And then I'm going to put Showdown still in D tier. I just really don't like Showdown. So this is kind of my like overall, at the end of the day, tier list, which is a huge cop-out. I should order A tier, so I like Plague of Shadows more than these two. It's a huge cop-out to put them all in A tier, but like it really does all even out, because like I really lambasted Plague of Shadows talking about from an objective perspective, but I also love it so much because of the context of its release and my personal preference. So it's a cop-out, but this is truly how I overall feel the tier list to be. So thank you for listening to my ramblings about Shovel Knight. I hope you're satisfied. I hope I gave kind of all my thoughts about the game. And the comment section of this video is going to be really, really fun to respond to. I actually can't wait. So I might actually make a video responding to comments instead of just responding to every comment the way I normally do. But, you know, that depends if this video gets a lot of comments or not. So thank you for watching and listening to my ramblings, and I'll see you guys in the next video.